Hi, it's Ashwin here. Today on Help Me I'm a Comedian, we'll get into some pretty heavy topics, including a story about a method of suicide. If you don't think you're up to listening, please don't put yourself through it. And if you or someone you know is in crisis, please seek help. You can call Lifeline anytime on 13 11 14. Starting a family can be easy for some people. It can even be unintentional. But for others, it's impossible. And learning that it's impossible can leave you with grief, anger, a sense of failure, and the realisation that your infertility makes everyone around you uncomfortable. This is Help Me I'm a Comedian. I'm Ashwin Segkar, and with me as always to unpack the mind of a comedian is psychologist Rachel Hannam. Today we're chatting to Andrew Nason, who was trying to start a family with his then wife when he learned he had a 0 sperm count. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, crikey, that's a hell of an intro.
Never get to introduce you on stage that way, unfortunately.
No, probably a good thing, really.
How did the doctor share that news with you?
There were quite a few steps in finding out that you're infertile, and already at that point there were 2 lots of tests that came back that said there was no sperm, but we had been told by the doctors that often that's just because there's a blockage, highly unlikely that you won't have any sperm whatsoever. We went in together, and he just went, zero sperm count. Looks like she can have children. Here you go. And handed me a referral to a donor.
So not a lot of sensitivity or empathy from that doctor?
I would say none.
No. It must have been such a shock and such a challenge to your sense of self.
It totally pulls the mat out from underneath you.
Yes.
In terms of what it means to be a man.
Had you realised until that moment how integral it was to your sense of being a man?
I don't think so, because you just assume that because everything else functions perfectly and you know, there's ejaculation, all that kind of stuff, you just kind of assume that it's all working, and so you don't even think about it really. And even the lead up, so when my wife and I got married, we didn't want kids, and I didn't actually have any paternal instincts. I wasn't craving having children or anything like that. And after about 3 months of being married, my then wife said she'd changed her mind, and after 6 months she'd even started denying that she'd ever said that we weren't thinking about having children. So I went on a bit of a journey of discovery, as it was, and we basically set a time limit. It started out a year, but it went for 18 months. I asked for an extension, please, miss. And I spoke to basically everyone I knew who was a father, particularly people working in the same industry as me. And to a man, they all basically went, look, it's a great adventure, you know, something worth doing. And one of the things that kept popping up was that people would say, it's just like watching a little you growing up, you know. And so after about 18 months, I had totally gone, this is going to be awesome. My wife had found out very late in life, I think a year or 2 before this happened, that she was adopted. So she was a late knower, and we actually worked it out and discovered it. She wasn't told it by the people involved. And that had really pulled the rug out from under her sense of self. But what that meant was that she was really determined to have her own biological family. So by that stage, I was too old to run the hoops for adoption, but I don't think even having a donor was going to be an option either, because that's not what she really wanted.
It would have been quite triggering for her, I imagine, thinking, I'm going to have a child who doesn't know their biological father, just like I didn't.
And on top of that, the paper for her master's had been to compare the laws at the time between adoption and sperm donor. And back then, a lot of sperm donation was completely anonymous, and we had discussed it a lot. We'd done a lot of reading, and we had both realised that it can't be anonymous. We both feel very strongly, I assume she still does, that a person has the right to know who their biological parents were. So that meant that if we were going to go down the path of a donor, that person would have to be known. I think, though, that the whole path of donor sperm is not as easy as a lot of people would suggest. Almost to a person, every female that we told, like, their initial response would always be, oh, poor Deborah. Not one person went, how are you? And then they would say, oh, just get a donor. Like, how are you? So many people just threw these kind of platitudes at me, but things that were ultimately, in a lot of ways, quite damaging. The number of people who said stuff like, oh, you would have made such a good father. Like, and that struck me even now, where I'm sure that if someone was in an accident and they lost their legs, no one would go, oh, you would have made such a good runner. You know, you probably would have made the Olympics, or maybe they do. I don't know. But you know what I mean? Like, it was this whole kind of like...
It's pretty insensitive, isn't it?
Yeah. And something that I'd said before about the whole, you know, just get a donor was just kind of totally ignoring my feelings, because there's that whole, you know, masculinity thing of having another man impregnating your wife kind of deal. So if you're in that situation, you know, don't be afraid to ask the person how they're feeling, rather than trying to make them feel better.
Or ask them, what's this been like for you? I think people are afraid of vulnerability.
Yeah.
They hear your story, they sense your vulnerability, that triggers their vulnerability, they try to shut it down by saying something like that. Whereas I think we have to get better at the vulnerability and say, oh my gosh, that must be hard. What's it been like? How are you?
Yep.
Yeah. You mentioned before that shame stopped you seeking professional help. And if we define shame as just simply a negative focus on the self, that's all it is, right? Not all it is. It doesn't feel good at all. No one talks about it, but this is what it is, that negative focus on the self. What was, once you found out about your infertility, what was that negative focus? What were the thoughts? What was the self-talk that went on after that?
Not worthy.
Not good enough.
Not good enough. Distinctly the feeling that I was only ever going to be an observer of life. Like, my role now was just to kind of sit back and watch everyone else, you know.
Diminished your sense of purpose in life. Yeah.
One of the big things that I think we discovered in the journey, and I had also discovered this since, is that a lot of people having children becomes their purpose. I've had at least 2 friends that I know of who have said to me that in their darkest times, they wouldn't still be here if it wasn't for the fact that they had children. And so it kind of meant that I had to redefine what my purpose would be.
Did you manage to do that? Think about yourself being a comedian as you grew older, or some other alternative child-free life?
That became very difficult, Ashwin. It was, I don't know that being a comedian sits in the same category as being a parent. So finding a purpose became very difficult.
Was this the first time you'd had to accept something quite significant that you couldn't change?
No. I had lost my mother when I was 26, and there you go, there's something that you can't change. So I've dealt with kind of grief and anguish over things before. I have a physical characteristic that I've had since birth that I can't change, and that's something that's kind of affected me. But again, that thing is a bit like something that's hidden that no one can normally see under normal circumstances. Very much like infertility, like for all intents and purposes, if you look at me, I'm just a normal man, but I don't feel that way.
Even now?
To some extent, yeah. Being completely honest, yes.
Yeah.
Even now. I have kind of come to terms with it a bit, but it's taken a very long time. And there was a whole lot of other stuff that went on that, in terms of how my marriage ended, that also led to in a roundabout kind of a way, like an attack on my masculinity. That just was...
Because your marriage ended largely because of this issue?
I would have to say solely because of this issue.
Solely?
Yeah.
Can you talk about what happened for anyone else who might be in this situation? Can you explain the story of how the relationship changed and deteriorated after you got the news?
Obviously, I'm just talking from my story, right? And so this is all part of my story, and I'm sure that other players in the story would have very different views on it and all those kinds of things. And so a lot of stuff would be seen by me as being quite negative. I assume that other players in the story would go, well, I didn't see it that way, or I don't remember it that way. But there was very little communication between my partner and I about the issue. A couple of times we did speak about it, and she basically said to me that, you know, she had kind of got to the point where, and the exact word she said was that she loathed even the sight of me. And I think I kind of realised that it was all over. Unfortunately, rather than kind of talking it out and moving away amicably, I, at the time, had a person that I thought was my best friend. He had taken a shine to my wife and basically started telling her that he would have children with her. And to the best of my knowledge from everything that I saw and witnessed, they started having an affair, and we went to one counselling session, and 15 minutes into the counselling session, my wife announced that it was all over, and it was like turning off the emotional taps. That was it for me.
For you.
I was just gone. And then the day after that, my best friend, I'm using a little inverted commas thing here, let me know that he'd broken up with his wife. Well, what a surprise. And then in the lead up to that, I guess not necessarily because of my infertility, but because of what was going on, he was, in retrospect, doing things to assert himself as the dominant male. And so that, again, was kind of pushing against my masculinity.
So even though you were numb and the emotional tap turned off, at another level you must have been devastated.
Yes, I was. And then I went to a very, very dark place, because not only was I dealing with the infertility, which I hadn't actually dealt with at all at that point, I was then dealing with the betrayal of the two people that I trusted the most in my life. And I went into a very dark place, and for the first 12 months or so, I had what I felt was a very tight-knit, close friendship group, and they had decided kind of further on that my wife deserved a second chance and had kind of invited her back into the friendship group. And I wrote an email to everyone basically going, this is why I can't be in the same space as her. And it was very full on. I was very open about stuff that had gone on. And then my what I thought was a close-knit friendship group also turned off the taps. That was it. And so whilst my wife deserved a second chance, I apparently didn't.
Ashwin Segkar and Rachel Hannam with you on ABC Radio, and our guest today on Help Me I'm a Comedian is Andrew Nason. As much as you can you explain the darkness, what you were internally going through or what you were doing at that time?
One of the other things that happened beforehand was that another very close friend of mine, who turns out is a close friend, he was getting, I'm going to say, being pressured by his partner to have a child. And we had talked about it. We said, hey, let's do this together. We can both be dads together, you know, we can go and do the dad thing. And 2 weeks before I discovered that I couldn't have children, they found out they were pregnant. And I'm not sure he's ever forgiven me for that. He has, obviously. He's a much bigger person than that. So there was all that going on, and I kind of felt like the best way maybe to describe it would be imagery. If you can imagine a bottomless pit, and I'm throwing out grappling hooks and trying to grasp onto anyone and anything I can to not fall into the pit. And that particular friend was one of the people who got the brunt of that. I would not be able to sleep, and at 5 o'clock in the morning I'd go out walking and end up on his doorstep, which fortunately was okay because they had a newborn child.
So they were awake.
And they were awake anyway.
You know, the depression, anxiety, stress scale, which almost all psychologists use with new clients, asks questions about depression like, how often have you felt life is meaningless or felt worthless or found no energy or enthusiasm to do anything at all or couldn't work up the initiative to do things? And all of these things must have been true for you at that time, I imagine, Andrew. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? There's this feeling this awful, horrible darkness.
That is the perfect, the darkness, cold and chilling blackness.
No light coming through.
And, you know, people kind of talk about the pits of hell in kind of religious terms. I'm not a religious person at all. I'm a very devout atheist. But that whole kind of wailing and gnashing...
the long, dark night of the soul.
Yep. I don't think there's no wailing and gnashing. There's just nothing.
Nothing.
And it's cold and chilling and, yeah. And...
Did you have any friends or a counsellor at that stage to help you through?
No. Yes, I did. Clearly there were, like, my friend that I would turn up to at any time of the day or night.
Was he understanding?
Yes. But, of course, they just had a newborn child, and so, you know, like, he was really focused on that, or had to be focused on that, obviously. Yeah, and I was using a lot of recreational drugs, drinking a lot, all that kind of stuff. Prior to all this happening, my career had been kind of kicking along. I came late into the comedy thing, but I had not long before all this happened finished writing for a show for the ABC. I was doing regular weekly radio spots that I managed to keep going for about a year after all the shit hit the fan, and then that just kind of dissolved too. And I was able to turn up for gigs, but it was just kind of rote, you know. I can remember doing a gig at the casino where I was emceeing a show where literally I was on stage going, "Hey, everybody, how funny is this? Here's our next person." And I'd walk off stage and literally tears would be pouring down my face. And then I'd wipe my face off and jump back up on stage and go, "Hey, everybody, yeah, let's all have a laugh."
And comedy was no help or antidote at this stage?
No. Sorry. Sorry to all those people that think it is. No.
Yes.
No, it wasn't.
I think Hannah Gadsby's right about that, isn't it? It's not therapy, it's something separate.
Yep. It's something totally separate. It's therapy often for the people that are listening. But I do actually remember one of the nights at the casino, and it could have been that night, this lady from the audience just came up to me and just went, "I can see that there's something very, very wrong for you. Like, you're very funny, but there's something..."
Some people are very intuitive, aren't they?
And she gave me a poem that she'd written on a napkin that I still have in my box of things that I keep.
Did the fact that she really got you in that moment help at all?
In retrospect, yes, but at the time, no, because I didn't want the world to know that, you know, there was this horrible thing. It got so bad at one point that I took a whole lot of pills late one night, and it was just too much. And the amazing thing about that was that what saved me was a call from my dad, of all things. Can
you tell us about the call?
Just out of the blue. It was like about 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, and he was normally a person that would go to sleep. And, you know, purely coincidental, but I'd drunk a lot. Had a gut full of alcohol and a gut full of life. And I had all these old sleeping pills and I took them. And I was just kind of starting to lose consciousness. And the phone rang. And I can only describe this, it was like an outside force. And as I said, I'm a complete atheist, right? So I don't believe this, but it felt like someone had grabbed the collar of my shirt and lifted me up off the ground and forced me to go over to the phone. And it was my dad. And he just said, "I thought I needed to ring you."
And did you tell him what you'd just done?
No. I told him I was drunk. But the movement of getting up and going to the phone made me sick.
So and you threw up the pills. Yeah.
Everything that was in there. And then it was not planned or anything like that. So there was no notes or anything. And I'd just end up on the floor.
I've heard so many stories like this in my work of people making that decision and then something like that happening. That's not the first time I've heard that story. I'm an atheist too, but I kind of go, what's that? There's something serendipitous there.
Yeah. And the fact that because of the nature of what this is all about, the fact that it was my dad that chose to call.
There's some transpersonal psychology going on there or something.
What would you have needed during that time? What would have helped you that you weren't getting at that time?
I think understanding something to basically go, it's okay. Like, you're still a man. You know, it's okay, and I still accept that. And I think the fact that my wife had gone, well, you know, you're not good enough. It came at me from all kind of different angles.
It sounds like you felt so invalidated and invisible in all of this, Andrew.
Yes, invisible's a good thing. I really totally felt like I had been completely cast aside.
Do you have any earlier experiences of that? Feeling rejected, feeling cast aside, feeling neglected or overlooked?
I'd been in a relationship prior to that with someone who had a child, and so I'd played kind of like the step parent, and it was not good. Even though we were living together as a family, myself, this lady and her child, I had absolutely no input whatsoever into the child. And the mother and the child's father would have these screaming arguments on the steps of our house, and then she would come back in and take out her anger on me, but I wasn't allowed to have any input into what had gone on in terms of the screaming argument. So that made my view of what it would be like to have a third person in the biological triangle a little bit, you know, skew if...
Well, it was a very disempowering experience. You felt pretty powerless in that situation with that child and your partner. So it was different in the second scenario with your friend and your ex-wife, but still very disempowering. But in that powerlessness, you know, that's part of depression, is feeling helpless.
Completely.
Rachel, can you tell us about that feeling of invisibility, what impact that has on people?
Oh, huge impact. We come into this world, and once we've developed some sense of self by the age of 1.5, we realise we are separate, and we realise we're utterly dependent on the adults around us. And a part of that absolute dependency is knowing that we're being seen, because if we're not being seen and acknowledged and understood, how are our needs going to get met? So this is very primal stuff. And if you go to any playground, you'll see kids at the top of the slippery slide going, Dad, Mum, look at me. That need to be seen doesn't go away at any age. You know, I've worked with people in aged care homes. We have a biological imperative to be seen. So to feel invisible, to not feel seen, to not feel understood, is very painful. It actually travels through the pain neurocircuitry of our brain and body.
And of course you're talking to comedians, so we're a group of people that are out there going, hey, look at me, everybody, look.
Which is a different, it's sort of like, look at my persona, but then there's that other thing of look at my pain, look at the real me, you know, what's underneath as well. And that's what you didn't get.
No, very intense.
I just want to validate for anyone listening that that's all it takes. You know, often we think about depression and mental health struggles as having resulted from, you know, some really overt, obvious, terrible thing, but just an acute and chronic experience of no one seeing, no one acknowledging, no one understanding. That's all it takes. For anyone listening, I want to differentiate between the different kinds of trauma. So going to war and seeing terrible things or being in an accident, we could consider this shock trauma, you know. But there are other types of trauma. Developmental trauma is what people can experience growing up in chaotic, scary households or experiencing abuse as a child. And then relational trauma we can experience as an adult, whether it's going through a situation like yours, Andrew. I've worked with people who've been bullied and harassed in the workplace. This is also trauma, but it's relational. It's not a big shock, but it's this ongoing, chronic, low-level trauma that leaves its imprint. So, Andrew, after you had that phone call with your father that night, do you remember much more about that night after you got off the phone to him the next day? Yeah, what happened?
What I can remember is that I went and crashed on the bed and basically passed out, although it felt more like just going to sleep than passing out, right? I was kind of aware that I had thrown up most of what I had taken because I could quite clearly see it. But the next day I felt really horrible for my dad. And I think I really went, basically, I can't do this to him, because if I had succeeded, I'd kill him. And he would blame himself, because that's the kind of guy he was.
So was it a bit of a turning point for you then?
Yeah, it was an absolute turning point. And I feel really awful because since then my dad's passed away. And I never had the courage to actually tell him that had happened, because I knew that he would take it so personally, that he would have basically gone, it was his fault.
Blamed himself for your suicidal depression.
I never got the chance to tell him, and I kind of regret that.
Yeah, you would have liked to have told him. Why?
To say thank you.
Yeah.
And there are still times when I kind of go, what's the point?
Why bother? What's the point? Yeah, I just want to normalise that. That's actually very common. The statistics bear out the fact that 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people have contemplated suicide.
Wow.
1 or 2 in 10 have made an attempt. That's a lot of people.
That is a lot of people.
And I think everybody's mind can be a destructive place at times. I'm a psychologist, but I know that place as well. I think we've all had a taste of that, if not, a huge dose of that. So I'm saying that to normalise. The human mind can be an amazing creative place, but it can also be a painful and destructive place.
And we don't know that because we never talk about these dark thoughts that we all have. And so we just assume that life is quite sanitised, but I think we've all had quite dark thoughts.
Exactly. One of the things I love about the show is there's been more male comedians, hasn't there, Ashwin?
Yeah.
Female comedians come on, and all of them have spoken so openly about their struggles. And I think that's so important, because even more so than women, men don't do this.
And, just talking to other people and being open and honest with them, quite recently, one of the very male comedians who's been on this show, he basically said he can't believe how resilient I am. And that came as a bit of a shock, because in my eyes, given that, my life fell apart, I went to that very, very dark place, and on so many levels, it never, particularly just in terms of my career, it never got back on track. And so I don't see myself as resilient at all. And to have someone whom I love and respect going, I actually think you're amazingly resilient. And because obviously he's been on this show and he's got his own struggles, to have someone who personally I think his struggles were a lot more full on than mine, to go, you're really resilient, was really quite, wow, okay.
It's a really good reframe.
Of course, internally, I'm just going, well, that's a load of rubbish. But
it sounds like later on you took it on board. Can you see your own resilience now?
I can see it to a certain extent. And whilst I do have occasional dark days and dark thoughts, I don't think they go anywhere near what they once did. I now have a partner who I love deeply, and she loves me for exactly who I am. And that has been a major turning point for me, to have someone who actually just went, you are perfect.
Wonderful. Yeah. The trauma experts say that any wound that was created in a relationship can only be healed in relationship. Does that resonate for you?
I think it does, yeah. And I'm starting to feel that healing now. And even now, there are times that I go, well, I'm just not worthy of you, because you're so wonderful to me.
Andrew, Nason and Rachel Hannam, thank you for coming in.
Great chatting.
Yeah, thanks, Ashwin.
On ABC Radio, this was Help Me, I'm a Comedian. If the conversation today has made you want to talk to someone, Lifeline provides 24-hour crisis counselling. Their number is 13 11 14, or you can find other resources at beyondblue.org.au. Alternatively, you can speak to your GP now and arrange Medicare-supported sessions with a psychologist. I'm Ashwin Segkar, and this was the last episode of the season for Help Me, I'm a Comedian. You can find this and all of our other interviews on the ABC Radio website, abc.net.au/radio/programs/editor's choice.